I'd like to bid you all a very warm welcome to the Africa-China Journalists Forum for 2018. So far the rain has stayed away mostly, as it's not raining right now, but we do have a little bit of a crackling sound that comes through on the sound system every now and then. So please bear with us. Hopefully it's not too bad, but it seems to be coming from up there, but hopefully it's manageable. Just a couple of quick notes, housekeeping notes before I introduce Prof. Coupe to do the official welcoming. We did have a few late changes in the program. You'll do see from the one that's in front of you, the program that you have there. Unfortunately, Mr. Srwanja, the journalist from Uganda, had a misfortune in his family and could not travel to South Africa. So I think we'll just be a bit flexible with time. We did start a little bit late, so I think we'll probably be okay. And that's about it. So I just want to say very welcome, and I want to introduce Prof. Coupe. So thank you.
I've touched something I shouldn't have touched. Okay. Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the 6th Africa-China Journalists Forum. I understand this forum started in 2013. It's been going strong since then. I think, as you know, we have a very strong Africa-China reporting program led by Barry and others at this university, and we're very proud of that program. So a very warm welcome to all of you. I understand there are journalists, filmmakers, photographers, and others, and I've been taken through a preview of the photo exhibition. Absolutely interesting images, and images tell 1,000 words. Now, why is this important, and why do we value it? I think, as you know, journalists are critical to a number of things, to democracy and to economic development and social progress. Without journalists, you will not get the kind of reporting that provides information that empowers citizens and others, and including governments, to be able to pursue democratic agendas, economic agendas, and social agendas that improve the life of everybody. Without journalists also, you do not get the global connectivity that you should have in the kind of complex world that we live in today. So part of the reason why this forum is important for us is that we at Wits believe very much in global connectivity of the different professions, and in this specific instance, of journalists and the media. And because Wits sees itself as does South Africa and the continent as part of a changing, complex, dynamic world, where people are not isolated, activities are not isolated, where impacts move in multiple directions. And as you know, China is now a very important player in the world. It is no longer that in Africa we relate only to the United States and to Europe or the EU. We relate also to China, which is a rising global power, economic power, and political power as well. And China has made a number of investments, enjoys a lot of relationships with many governments. If you look at this program alone, you can see from the stories that have been written the geographic spread of the influence of China and its activities across the continent. Now, the sharp light of journalists, including investigative journalists, is very, very important when you have those kinds of relationships. As we know, where there is relationships of power, there is also issues of power that arise. Is this to the benefit of the generality of the population? Is this for the advancement of the globe and to general global progress and national and societal progress? Journalists come in there actually to shine a spotlight and to find out whether these things are actually done in what the official declarations actually say and in what the politicians actually say to us. So I think that that is a very important contributor to a positive kind of globalization, if you like. Because people often think that globalization is a positive thing in and of itself. Yes, it has some positive elements in that, for example, Africa now is not heavily reliant on the US and the EU. There is China where they can create other relationships. But in that relationship with China as well, issues arise. And I think that it is this forum that actually, in a sense, can say, in addressing questions of trying to fashion out or craft out a positive globalization, what are the issues between China and Africa? What are the issues that shine a spotlight on what Africans do to themselves, and also what is the impact on internally in China itself. I think those are very, very important things going forward. So I'm delighted that many of you have accepted the invitation to come here. Many of you are making a presentation, both from the continent and from China itself. I'm also delighted that some of you attended the other conference that just ended, I think yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, the African Investigative Journalism Conference, and are also continuing in this. I think that is a good way of leveraging one conference and the next, and ensuring that we can spend more time with each other. As I said at the other conference, and I'll say it here, I've already alluded to it. All forms of journalism are important. Investigative journalism is particularly important because it deals with those complex, dark areas where daily journalism or news reporting and analysis might not get to. That's not their work. But investigative journalism is the painstaking business of looking beyond the appearance and the daily events, of doing serious research, of connecting things that appear not to be connected, and thereby paint the real picture. And so, I think the China-Africa Forum must ensure also that when it looks at all forms of journalism, that investigative journalism does not fall off the roof and does not fall off the table, and is an integral part of what the forum actually does. I think at the end of this, good journalism, whether it's investigative or informative, analytical reporting, is good for the world. It is good for Africa, and it is good for China. Good journalism will actually ensure that the China-Africa relationship at the economic, global, social, and cultural level is about a relationship between human beings and human societies, building each other for the better. And it's also for the best of global stability, a positive globalization, and a better life for all. So with those words, I'd like to say to you, I officially open this Africa-China Forum. Please engage in as much intense debate as you can. Every form of knowledge we produce in this platform makes a difference for where the continent and its partners, including China, is going. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. I think this project has profited greatly from your support and the management support, and I want to thank you very much for that. So right now we're going to have two short presentations by my colleagues Bob Okesa and Wu Yushan, and I think after that we'll go straight into the first panel with the investigative journalists. So I just want to say a special welcome to all the photographers and investigative journalists who are here today. This event in here is really about you and for you to tell us about your work, and your work is incredibly important. So let me introduce my colleague Bob. He's quickly just going to give us a report back from a workshop that this project did in Abidjan in October, in the first week of October this year, which really was for this project a step into a new direction, where so much of our work over the last decade has focused on the Anglophone world, reporting in English, and also Chinese, and maybe sometimes also a little bit of Arabic, African languages, other languages as well, but it was small. Mostly it was just English. And this workshop we held in Abidjan was a French language training workshop for us to really go into the Francophone world, which is another big African language spoken in Africa. And Bob was in attendance, and Bob, you're going to just tell us a bit about that. After that, we're going to have my colleague Wu Yushan, who is a research associate with the project, and she's going to tell us a little bit about the 10 years of the project. The project is now pretty much 10 years old. It's been going all the way since 2009. Real activity started in 2010, so Yushan is just going to tell us a little bit about that. We've spent the last little time looking back at the last 10 years, what was good, what was bad, what didn't work, some interesting statistics, and while we're also looking to the future, and that will come in 2019. So, Bob, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. So thanks for turning up for this forum. And as Barry has mentioned, mine is a very brief expose on what it is that we... Sorry. Oh, okay. So mine is a very brief expose on what it is that we were able to accomplish in Abidjan, Cote d'Ivoire, in the first week of last month, during which we engaged with colleagues from the Western Africa region, but focusing not so much on Nigeria, Ghana, Liberia, or Sierra Leone, which are Anglophone or English-speaking Western African countries, but actually focusing on the countries of the region that are Francophone, or Francophone if you wish. On arrival there at the airport in Abidjan, the first thing that struck me was that my attempt at speaking any little French I knew fell completely flat. And my attempt to speak English fell even more flat. So much so that we were reliant on essentially translation. And so you feel that handicap of not being able to communicate with colleagues. Looking at me, I mean, when I arrived in Abidjan, I would have looked like any Ivorian. But until you speak to someone, because then you realize that no, there's a language problem. And that indeed is the thinking that went into our spreading our tentacles, or our approach towards spreading our tentacles beyond the English-speaking part of the continent. As Barry has mentioned, we have had a large footprint on Anglophone African countries, mostly in Southern and Eastern Africa. Only last year did we start to consider the Francophone African countries, getting stories on African China, in Burundi, in Cameroon. I think there's a colleague from Cameroon here, and I think it was Morocco. So what are the lessons that we did learn during this training program? One is that it's very interesting that the Africa-China relations are almost certainly also related to the colonial powers that rule this continent. And therefore, when you are in French-speaking Africa, you actually need to consider the Paris connection, or the connection of Paris, the connection of France to this, to the Africa-China narrative. To start with, for example, all the Francophone African countries, represented by colleagues there from Mali, Cote d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, Benin, and Togo, all these countries operate under the French franc. They use the franc as their currency, unlike the way we use the shilling in much of East Africa, or the rand in South Africa. So their economies and their financial systems are tied very closely to the French financial system, and financial systems and economy. For that reason, therefore, Africa-China relations in those countries has to factor in the French perspective. In fact, one of the things that then strikes you out there in French West Africa is the fact that China and these countries actually sometimes have to undertake a trilateral arrangement in which French and France plays a crucial role in structuring deals. Because to some extent, in fact, many of these countries are indebted to France already through loans and so forth. So if you are structuring a new loan, you have to factor in, I mean, if one of those countries is structuring a loan or a grant or any other financial arrangement, they have to factor in the fact that France has an interest there. With particular respect to the media sector, one finds that there's pretty much competition between emerging Chinese media such as StarTimes, which is a pay TV station, and the dominant pay TV channel they are called Canal Plus. So if you look at it from English-speaking Africa, you find that there's competition between the pay TV station, Chinese pay TV station called StarTimes, and the South African giant called MultiChoice. In Francophone Africa, on the other hand, MultiChoice is not so much dominant there. Instead, there's Canal Plus, which is a French outlet, and it's in competition with StarTimes. We did find that the Chinese have actually increased their presence in the media. They are launching the French version of China Daily, launching Xinhua news agency, bureaus in a number of countries there. in fact, while in Cote d'Ivoire, I had the occasion to go to the Star Times head office in that country and just to look at what they are doing there. So I think those of us who are in the Anglophone Africa region might imagine that China is only relating with us using the medium of English as a language. But the Chinese have actually gone on to master French, not so much to relate with just France, but also to relate with Francophone-speaking countries. I think there are also a number of differences that we did find out while on the training program. And it was that while we think that investigative journalism, for example, in in English-speaking African countries is facing lots of challenges and so forth, the Francophone West Africa feel that investigative journalism has not even started off in those countries. The tradition of going beyond the surface to uncover stories beneath the ground, as it were, is not as established in that part of the world as it was. So I, and in fact a colleague of mine called Cobas, who was also on the training program, had actually to kind of take a session to just kind of inform and educate and share perspectives on some of the investigative reporting projects that have been undertaken in South Africa, in Angola, in Kenya, in Uganda, and so forth. So I think that was an interesting thing to do. So from here, where do we go next? What we are looking to do, I mean, this was not an idle or something that we wanted to do for fun. We are doing it for a long-term objective. And the long-term objective is essentially to encourage our Western African French-speaking countries to bid for grants from the project and go on then to dig their investigative journalism approaches deep into the ground to find out what is happening with, between Africa and, say, Cote d'Ivoire, Africa, and, say, Mali, Africa, and Burkina Faso, and so forth. And so in the next couple of weeks and months, we shall actually be seeing grants given to these journalists from these countries, and therefore start accessing knowledge on what's happening between Africa and China in those in those countries. Thank you for your listening to me. I'll stop here. Cheers.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Ishen, for those of you I haven't met. And so I grew up in South Africa, and coincidentally, I've been doing research on Africa, China, on and off since 2010. And so middle of this year, I started working with the project at Wits Journalism, and what was interesting was one of the specific outcomes was they asked me to review the project and analyze all their reporting over the last few years. And I suppose that's one way to really get to know a project, is to look at all their reporting. And so I think what is interesting is, for me, someone who's new to the journalism space and to the project, I wanted to kind of provide my insider-outsider perspective. So we decided, rather than giving you a rundown about the project, which you can see on the website, we wanted to show you how we see the project's current role, its evolution, and perhaps also where it's going. And hopefully, I think this will open up further collaborations and contributions from everyone here. And I think that's a very important component of this forum. So just on some points to share. So what is the project's role as of 2018? I think even before our time at the project, one of the main impetus of this project was the realization of the very polarized reporting on Africa-China issues. So very positive reporting and possibly negative reporting. And what was, I think, missing is more nuanced reporting on, based on facts and in-depth stories. So leading from that is predominantly, I think, the main activity of this project of supporting journalism related to Africa-China issues. So I think that is important, and over the last few months, we've been debating this a lot, is what is the role of the project in this? I think from what I can see, it is really a facilitation process. So it, to help journalists begin their stories, give advice on how to report, etc. But I think we also have to recognize one of the limitations is it's not necessarily the project's role to determine the opinions of journalists who themselves are subject to their own editing processes and media organizations. So that's one element. But I think what is encouraging is I came across a study this year written by Zhang and Matinguina, and they actually reviewed journalism projects looking at Africa-China. And I think, so they looked at this project and another project, and so they reviewed this Trailblazers collection of Africa-China reporting from the project between 2009 and 2014. And what they found was, out of the stories that they found that they would label new controversies, so that included issues around wildlife or gold mining, they found that the reports were relatively nuanced and provided a lot more context rather than a negative or positive opinion. And I think that's really what the project is motivating for. So I thought that was quite interesting that academics outside of the project, that's what they found. But also, this project is also about networking, that there's 1,500 network of journalists, and I think that's important, and we should try to grow that. And also, increasingly, I think I've noticed more collaborations between the project and others, such as HKO1, the China-Africa project that hosts a weekly podcast, as well as China House, who's here today, the Institute for Global Dialogue, and the larger Wits community. And there's also the role of capacity building, which Bob just mentioned. And I think this is important because I don't necessarily think it was the initial focus of the project, but it's become increasingly important. And I say this because it's not just about an end product, an article that's written by a journalist. And we have to recognize that the learning process takes place before that as well. So the project has engaged in, for example, toolkits. For example, the Forum on China-Africa toolkit that they produced with the China-Africa project to help journalists understand the context of China-Africa relations rather than only focusing on headlines. There's also training workshops, which Bob mentioned, that took place last month, as well as there was a workshop in Addis last year in 2017. So having said all this, I would also see this project as a work in progress. So these are kind of the roles that it's fulfilled this year, but the project has to fit in the larger journalism space and Africa-China field. And we surveyed some other journalism projects around the world. I think we looked at about 20. And the main activities that these programs look at would be capacity building, grants focused, geographic focus, even niche areas. So for example, I think we looked at Stanford Journalism, and their main focus is to serve the community and report on how, for example, Silicon Valley is impacting the community itself. And of course, there's also advocacy. So I think besides advocacy being the main direction, I think the project actually straddles various activities that I've mentioned. But I think what is important is that there's very few reporting projects that focus on Africa-China stories, and specifically its impact on Africa and African interests. I also think another area is, if we look at Chinese and African policymakers and the FOCAC process, the role of engaging in people-to-people relations and bringing people closer through scholarships, through media, through Confucius Institutes, for example, is important and growing, and they continue to emphasize this, and they're putting more capital into these initiatives. While that's important, I think less emphasis is actually the non-government drives, such as this project, that are bringing people together. And I say this is important because I think government capital to bring people who are, societies who are far apart together is important, but what happens after that? How do you motivate people to actually engage and continue this relationship? So therefore, the non-government aspects are important as well. Having said that, I think what's been interesting is I think since I participated in an event in 2015 on FOCAC, I've noticed this project's roles also evolved in that it's also becoming a space, I think, that it fulfills a space between the formal and informal spaces. I say this because the project's also starting to host a lot more events that are linked to formal processes. For example, wildlife. And last year, China announcing that it wanted to close its domestic ivory trade ban. Or for example, next week, the project's going to host the second China-South Africa dialogue since its 20 years of bilateral relations. And also the FOCAC process. So I think it is filling an important role between official and unofficial spaces. And of course, I think Bongiwe and Barry have been really great at, they're just amazing at organizing events between the two of them. I think you're 4 in this month there. So now I'm going to just move on to some numbers. So again, this is just from reviewing the reporting that the project has provided me. And I would raise a caveat here and to say that, of course, it's very difficult to get 100% scientifically accurate numbers with an exercise like this because you are dealing with people and reports and I suppose journalists' grants. And there's a whole lot of interpretations that come with that. And naturally, because of the progress of the project has also changed hands. It's also changed, I guess, reporting methods. So we just have to keep that in mind. But what I'm doing here is giving you an overview, and I think it's still interesting to see the direction this project has taken. So I looked between 2012 and 2018, and in terms of general grants, the project has provided 142 out of 379 proposed grants. So these general grants are where journalists provide the topic and destination of reporting to the project, and then the project will then assess whether the project is durable in the amount of time, costs, etc. Then we go on to theme grants, which only was initiated in 2015. The project has provided 31 of 225 proposed grants. And what these are is where the project will then determine what the broader theme of the reporting will be, and the journalist will then come with a specific topic and area of or place of reporting. So altogether, I would say on average, the project is providing 24 grants a year. And we have to keep in mind that each report takes about 3 months from the proposal process all the way to completion. So sometimes the journalist undertakes field work or there's editing process, etc. And I think it's interesting, these numbers, because what it's saying is the project is also providing, what it can provide is less than what is in demand if we look at the number of proposals that we get. And another thing I found interesting is if you look at China-Africa academia, or what scholars talk about, or what African scholars are mentioning, is that a lot of reporting on Africa-China comes from outside of Africa. And when I looked at some of this reporting and where these articles were being published, I would say safely about 80% of the articles that the project supports are in African news platforms, which I think is encouraging. And I've just provided a list of examples here just from the last year. So moving on. This is quite interesting. What we did was we took the general grants. So this is what journalists propose to write about and in what country. So I took all the grants, including the ones that weren't accepted, and tried to figure out what countries are African journalists or journalists even Chinese journalists proposing to report on. So if we look at this, between 2014 and 2018, the top 6 countries are as follows. Kenya, we got 41 proposals. Zimbabwe 37, Uganda 29, Nigeria 21, Cameroon 17, and Malawi 15. So of course there were also categories that weren't country specific. So for example, we have a Pan-Africa category because those would be articles proposed on the African Union or the China-Africa Forum. And we also have to be mindful, the one thing that this does not capture is the fact that in the age of globalization, not every reporting is going to be within a country's borders. So there are also cross-border reports. For example, there were articles on Tanzania, Kenya, Cameroon, Nigeria, and Namibia, Zambia, sorry. Looking at this, also some of the topics that are emerging out of these top 6 countries would be issues such as environment and wildlife, construction, agriculture, education, and business operations. So I think what we could say is that there are multiple reasons why certain countries are more popular than others, and we do need to look further into this and probably engage with former journalists who've received grants. And I thought what was quite interesting is this project is based in South Africa, but over the 4 years, we've gotten 11 proposals from South Africa. So the focus of the project is not necessarily just South Africa. And I think what this provides then, especially for journalists, is possibly what are the popular countries, but also the gaps where future grants and stories can focus more on. So again, I think the project, where the project plays an important role is actually in the theme grants. So where the project decides what the theme of reporting will be that journalists then apply with proposals. And I say this because there are also topics where I think journalists don't necessarily propose on, and they do fall through the gap sometimes. And one of these areas was linked to a workshop that the project did last year, right, with Oxfam on industrialization. So it was agriculture, climate change, industrialization, sustainable development goals, and Agenda 2063. And it was interesting because if you go back to what journalists are proposing, Ethiopia only came up with 3 proposals in the last 3 years. So I think there were 20 participants at this workshop, and it was encouraging because I think they all wrote a media piece either on their own country, lessons from Ethiopia, or linked to one of these thematic areas. So so I think in terms of theme grants, that's where I think the project can contribute to Africa-China relations in terms of gaps in focus areas. And then I think another important role that the project plays is the training and workshops. As I mentioned, this was not necessarily a focus of the project before, and Bob talked about a specific example of Abidjan. But looking at the last 8 years, I've counted about, and maybe there are more, 108, there was training for 108 African and Chinese journalists. And the number is more or less on par, so it'll be 49 Chinese journalists and just over 50 for the African side. And I think this is an important aspect because, as I mentioned, the learning process is not just writing the article or the end product. So these are just examples of some of the workshops that the project engaged in. And I would say that the bringing of Chinese journalists to Africa was more focused between 2010 to 2014. And that was important because the project would then link these Chinese journalists with local reporters in the country that they're reporting in, and they would collaborate together. And more, I think the project's also focusing more on the capacity building of African journalists. So whether it was taking African journalists to China or Hong Kong, and I think more and more it's also allowing these journalists to interact with one another. So again, the Addis workshop, I think it was the equal participation of Chinese and African journalists. So finally is just then to talk a bit about, I think, some forward-looking thoughts that we've discussed. I think looking at this, again, I think it's important to consider the importance of unofficial spaces in the Africa-China relationship. And I think this project is one example of that. And I think one other thing that I found positive is that this project is also evolving over time. It shouldn't stay static because it needs to speak to the needs of journalists as well as the changing Africa-China field. So just some ideas of what we were thinking about, and Bob mentioned this previously, is to try and expand support and facilitation of reporting beyond, I think, the usual regions and look at North Africa and Francophone reporting. So I think that's one aspect. The second is expanding scope. What this means is, I think reporting and news reporting is still important and should be important. That's the focus of this project. But we also have to look at other, I think, media platforms, such as podcasts and even films, because these spaces also mediate the China-Africa relationship. And I think that was one of the reasons for the photo exhibition that will take place later today. Because I think when we use Google search Africa-China, a lot of the time you're seeing leaders shaking hands at big forums. But people have a very limited, I think, idea of what everyday Africa-China looks like. And because the project had a network of journalists based on the ground, it just made sense to also focus more on images as well. Again, I think we want to just emphasize it's important to still take the Africa First approach. While we're looking at the Africa-China relationship, I think the analysis has to always start from continental processes and the interests of the continent. So for example, with the Continental Free Trade Agreement that's still under debate, where do these external partnerships fit under that? Under issues of migration, and even where does Africa fit in the larger debate of the fourth industrial revolution? So those issues, I think, are still important because with Africa-China, much of the talk is about industrialization and manufacturing, but the global debate is fourth industrial revolution. So I think that's important. And then alongside this Africa First approach is, I think, also starting to think about Africa and the relationship and where it fits into, I think, the complex global dynamics. So, I mean, if we look at the two events we did on wildlife, the issue became bigger than just China-Africa. It's a global issue. So we have to consider that as well. And one other thing that we've been thinking about is, since the project is strong with Africa-China reporting, how do you take these experiences and link or collaborate with other projects in other regions to take a stronger South-South perspective? Because at the end of the day, we need to ask ourselves, are Africa-China links unique, or are trends actually being reinforced by linkages in other locations? So it's important to also consider this relationship in a broader context. And finally, just to end off, and I mentioned this, is alumni and networks. I think if you look at scholarship or government types of people-to-people linkages and exchanges, one of the challenges that they often find there is to maintain alumni relations, to make sure that there is, continued work, because I think sometimes journalists might report about an Africa-China story and then move on to another country or move on to another topic. How do you maintain this knowledge? And so I think that's important. And also just to engage journalists about what worked and what didn't work for them to keep the project, again, evolving. So I would just leave it there and just say what I've done is given you an overview of the project and some of the numbers, but I don't think the numbers tell you everything. We also have to think about the qualitative story. And I think that's why this event is important, because the journalists here today have done all the work, and they are the ones who add the color and texture to what we know as Africa-China relations. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Yushin. So right now we're going to go into our first panel. And I just want to say quickly before we do that part of this process that Yushan was talking about right now is that this year we decided that we wanted to actually do more. We wanted to move into a new direction, not just do a sort of low-level stories, but actually start doing investigative stories. And that's something that we did this year. And we had 7 of these grants that we dispersed this year, and I'm happy to say 6 of those journalists are here today to talk about their ongoing work. And so part of this process is to go a little deeper, to find, to look more than just the surface level, to look actually deeper, what's really going on and what's happening, with these investigative grants. So that's what we started doing this year. And to help us to work with these investigative journalists, we have our Caxton Professor of Journalism, Anton Harber, who is based at Wits Journalism, to help us with these investigative grants and the stories that are produced and the investigations as they are ongoing. So I'm going to ask Anton to come up, and Anton, you can just help us curate this first session, or at least facilitate this first session. We only have 2 journalists obviously here today. Mr. Sawanja is not here, unfortunately, but I also just want to say after this, we should take us to about 11:30 more or less, which will give us about half an hour before lunch for questions and answers. So maybe if 11:30, if all the speakers are so far can just come up and, at 11:30, and then we can have some questions and answers, a Q&A session. Let me then just say that I'm going to go next to Anton, and Anton will introduce our 2 speakers.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go straight into it without much ceremony. Let me just say that it's good to be here and good to see all of you here working on this project, which is important to us, and I think doing, as I think we saw, extremely valuable and interesting work. We have 2 speakers now, I've just heard, so it is the Ugandan speaker who isn't here, am I right? So we have a speaker who's been working in Swaziland and one working in Lesotho. So without lingering, I wonder if we could go to the first speaker, Pascalina Kabi from Lesotho. Let me hand over to you.
Thank you, Anton. My name is Pascalina Gabi from Lesotho. I work for the Lesotho Times as an investigative journalist. In 2014, the Lesotho Revenue Authority investigated a supermarket owned by a Chinese national who's now been naturalized as a Mosotho. His name is Ian, but he's popularly known as John in Lesotho. John was investigated for tax evasion, and he was found guilty, and his business was liquidated. Now, 4 years later, in 2017, August to be precise, the Prime Minister of Lesotho, Thomas Thabane, appointed John as his head of special projects and Prime Minister's special envoy and trade advisor on China-Asia network, a trade network. That caused a lot of uproar. People complained about his appointment based on the past business deals, and that he's regarded as a controversial businessman in Lesotho. The appointment was done in August, and a few weeks or days later, John he owns a lot of business entities in Lesotho, from construction, supermarkets, the abattoirs, everything you can think of. John has a hand in it in business in Lesotho. Now he is the second majority shareholder in Miraga Abattoir, the only abattoir in Lesotho. And just weeks after his appointment as Prime Minister's trade advisor, he relinquished, or he signed off his shares at the abattoir to his wife. And a few months later, the government of Lesotho came up with a policy putting on restrictions on the import of red meat in Lesotho, giving Miraga Abattoir a controversial monopoly in the business sector. And that caused a lot of uproar. People complained that the government of Lesotho was in a way paying back John for, one, housing the Prime Minister at his house, a suburb house in Maseru. He claims that the Prime Minister is paying rent, but close sources to the Prime Minister are also claiming that he's not paying rent. But what's peculiar about that, John says, I think he's paying 8,000. And that causes a lot of questions. how do you think when you are saying that he runs a business, he's also claiming that the Prime Minister didn't go to him to solicit that he rents a house. Some lady went to him and they actually found out days or months later that it was indeed the Prime Minister who stays there. The Prime Minister has been staying there since February 2017 when he returned from South Africa. Until last week when I talked to John, the Prime Minister was still paying rent at the house. Now, there are also allegations that the Prime Minister is right now building a house at his home. There are allegations that the house is being financed by John. When I passed through there 2 weeks ago, the construction works at the ground level were complete, and they were now on the second level. But it is difficult to tell how big the house is going to be, given that the construction works are only going through, and nobody wants to really tell if the size of the house is going to be. Now, Meraka Abattoir was investigated in 2011 for one, slaughtering 18 cows that were not sanctioned for slaughtering by meat inspectors, for allegedly washing intestines that were banned from being consumed, and without putting in legal frameworks to govern the sector itself. The government, through the Prime Minister, moves in and put restrictions. We don't have any legal frameworks that govern that sector, but we are continuing with that. And John, in an interview with me, says that he is the one who orchestrated the deal, that it started in 2014 when he suggested that the government, the Lesotho abattoir, should import red meat to China. And for that deal to work, the government needs to put on restrictions on the import of the red meat so that the abattoir can have enough experience to deal with red meat, to deal with customers and everything. But one wonders, why is government not putting legal frameworks first to ensure that the sector is well governed, that at least we know from what they are the sections that they are operating from. And there are strong allegations from the Prime Minister's Basotho Convention Party that the restrictions were put in place because when John first accommodated the Prime Minister as his house, he was promised that government will take care of him. Now they are insinuating that this is one way of government taking care of him, of ensuring that the abattoir stays in business and enjoy a monopoly that other businesses in the country are not enjoying. Right now, the butcheries, the retailers are complaining that the abattoir is enjoying unfair competition. They are also complaining that the abattoir is operating as a wholesaler, as a retailer, as a tenderpreneur, because right now it has been awarded 2 big contractors to supply meat at Lesotho Defence Force and Lesotho Correctional Service. But that is not enough with John. One, his jackpot properties is housing the Prime Minister. 2, Meraka is enjoying a business monopoly. 3, there is one company which he calls Bafani Construction. Bafani Construction, under the Prime Minister's first stint as a Prime Minister between 2012 and 2014, was paid 2 million for constructions works that were not done at the Lesotho Correctional Service. And he has not been taken to court. Nothing has been done about that, despite the fact that the Auditor General has raised that issue in his 2014 report. And the payment was done under very controversial circumstances because in Lesotho, when a construction company has finished a certain part of works, they produce a certificate that would be used to pay them. But now the certificates that were produced to pay him were done in 2 days. One today, the next tomorrow. And the payment was processed, no questions asked. The abattoir itself there are also allegations that it's supplying Lesotho's only referral hospital, Queen Mama Hato Memorial Hospital, with red meat as well. So you see, with John and his businesses, he operates, I think, in a way that he entices politicians with giving them or addressing their financial needs, and in return, he gets lucrative government tenders, and that has caused a lot of uproar in Lesotho, and many businesses are complaining that he doesn't only stop with his businesses, he also facilitates that other Chinese businesses get lucrative government tenders as well. Thank you very much.
Very interesting, and quite extraordinary how brazen it appears to be carried out. So I'm sure there'll be lots of questions and discussions around that. Our second speaker has been looking at similar issues around the relationship between business and government. Mongezi Patizwa Zulu from Swaziland. Mongezi.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mongezi Patizwe Zulu. I come from Swaziland. Perhaps I must point out early that whenever there are corruption issues in Swaziland, they always point to the highest authority in the land, which is the king. As an introduction, let me point out that Swaziland don't have ties with mainland China, but we have ties with Taiwan. So Swaziland has secret deals with mainland China. In a way, we can say it flirts with mainland China while it has diplomatic relations with Taiwan. Maybe I can also point out that my investigation revolves around the trade interactions between Swaziland and China, though we don't have diplomatic ties. A lot of our SMEs, we have seen a growing trend in terms of buying stock from China. They don't go to Taiwan. Even the king, when he buys, okay, those are allegations, that when he buys the sneakers for the Red Dance Maidens, they buy them from China, but not Taiwan. But it is kept a secret because I think because they avoid the diplomatic role. Okay, in my investigations, I have tried, because there is this ongoing debate. Should we dump Taiwan and go with China? In my investigation, I approached the SME sector, which is mainly indigenous businesses. Okay, they are quite divided. Some are saying China can play a role in terms of developing the SME sector in Swaziland? Well, some are saying the principle of reciprocity must come into play. They are saying, we can as well buy from China, but what are we going to sell to China? Because seemingly there is nothing Swaziland can sell to China, because they believe China has got everything. Those are the issues they've raised, and some of the issues that they've raised, those who are stocking their material from China are saying China must the problems they are facing is that of China would want them to buy in bulks when Swaziland's population is very small, so which becomes a problem. Fine, it's cheap, some of the things are of good quality. Of course, it depends on the purse one has, but they feel that the tendency to cause them to buy in bulks, sometimes it becomes a problem. One of the issues that I happen to came across is that of the trade rift between the US and China, because they are not allowed to stock some brands, American brands which are produced in China. So in some airlines, you find that airlines like Kenya Airways, they will say you are not allowed to stock that. Then they will be forced to leave those materials behind. So which is a problem. Also, they complained about the size. They say if China can, if Chinese businesses can consider the size, because we at the southern part of Africa we are a bit bulky in terms of size, then you find that they struggle to find the right size, the right sizes when it comes to clothes, because mainly they buy building materials, they buy electronic gadgets and fashion and some textiles. And we have seen the growing number of Swazis who are going to China over the last 5 years. So now they're saying if the air ticket is cheap, you are most likely to find at least 50 Swazis per day going to China. Okay, that's from the SME sector, but the academicians I approached, they were saying it's high time Swaziland opens diplomatic relations with China, because China is a key important player in Africa in terms of development and infrastructure. So they were arguing that the fact that we don't have the fact that China plays a key role, we are supposed to benefit from those activities taking place in Africa, because we also need industrialization, we also need development in terms of infrastructure. Then big businesses also was of the view that it's high time we dump Taiwan and consider opening our relations with China, because they are saying who benefits from the Taiwan relationship. They made allegations that it's only the king and his family. let me point out few projects, few interactions between Swaziland and the mainland China. Some few years ago, China built the King Sopuza Memorial Park in Swaziland. They also built the King Sopuza the second memorial stadium, which is at the south of Swaziland, which is Nhlangano. Also, there was a multi-billion rand deal which collapsed after the investor attached diplomatic ties condition in the agreement. Then the Swazi authorities, they felt like, no, we want the money, but when it comes to the issue of diplomatic relations, we are not yet ready for that. So that deal fell through. Okay, there are many projects which China has, rail projects, which China has showed interest in funding. The Swaziland Railway, at some point, the board was almost fired because of those dealings with China. When the Prime Minister heard that they held meetings with Chinese investors. But most of these interactions also happens outside Swaziland. The Inyati construction, where the king owns 50% shares, there are circulating rumors that they work with Chinese companies in Zambia. Inyati construction, which is owned by the king, has landed a lot of contracts in Zambia under the presidency of President Edgar Lungu, sorry. And there are also allegations that President Edgar Lungu owns Swazi Mobile in Swaziland, where he has a front allegedly by Mr. Shikantu, whose wife now is in parliament, is an MP. Probably she will become a minister very soon. So Swazi Mobile buys a lot of the phones and all the electronic gadgets from China, not from Taiwan. Even the private jet which the king uses right now, at some point it was owned, okay, it was bought or donated, should I say, by Taiwan, but at some point it was used by, or it belonged to China Airlines. Also, the interactions happens at a regional scale. SACU, there are ongoing trade negotiations between SACU and China, where Swaziland is a member. And in countries, I mean, in economic regions like SADC, AU, and COMESA. Maybe for now, I think I can stop here. Perhaps I will engage when there's a Q&A.
Take a seat. And will you join us again to come for the discussion? Thank you. Perhaps I can kick off the discussion by asking each of you a question, a journalistic question, to get things going, and then hopefully there will be more. But let me ask you this. How the information you got and you need to tackle these issues, to what extent in your country Is it difficult to get that? Is it difficult to access that? Is it difficult to access the people you need to speak to? Shall we use this?
Thank you very much. In Lesotho, it is really very difficult to access information and talk to people you need to assist in telling you what is happening. For instance, all along there were allegations that John indeed owned that house, but there was no proof at all that would say that indeed the house belongs to him. And every time we would ask him, or the journalist would ask him about the house, he denied owning that house. It was until recently when even the Lesotho Land Authority would refuse giving us any information that would link him to the property. It was only under this project that I managed to get hands on the copy of the lease, because now it was also going to be difficult to get that list. But someone from the Lesotho Revenue Authority gave me a big file that had all the John's business documents that had been submitted to LRM. And there was just a small piece like this one, with a lease number, an estimated cost, but it didn't, that's the paper that I used to go to LRA and say I have to Land Authority and say I have a lease number. Now can you check for me if this indeed exists? That's when they initially they refused, saying it's a private document, they can only release it to the owner. And then I had to go through and cultivate a source who eventually gave it to me. That's when John agreed that he owns the property. But until then, he would refuse. But even to talk to people, it's very difficult because people would know these things. They are eyeing a position in government. They don't want to come out with their names on the paper that indeed we know this. They'll always be saying, I want my identity hidden, because somehow, somewhere, all of them want a share on the slice of the cake that is a public purse.
Thank you. You know, access to information remains a huge challenge. Swaziland media environment still has those restrictive tendencies, even to the point that even journalists, they practice what they call self-censorship. So when you approach these government officials, even when they have the information, but they will decide to hide with it. So this is the challenge that I face. So you find that the source will tell you the information, but you'll have a problem in terms of validating or getting formal information that you can use. So it's a huge challenge, especially when one considers the interactions between Inyazi and the government of Zambia. So I was talking to some colleagues from Zambia that, guys, please, I think we need to collaborate on this issue, because such information is not easy. Even to get somebody that can leak that information. So it's a huge challenge which I think one needs to see how to work around that. Thank you.
Yes. Further questions? Anyone from the floor? Yes. Would you introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi, my name is Christiane Batchley, and I have a sort of follow-up question to the last one, and it has to do with not just access, but how you work to get people to go on the record. My experience working on a few investigative stories has been that I find people, African, Chinese, willing to talk at times, but unwilling to go on the record. And I am doing work largely for American outlets, and so I might also talk to American government, embassy officials, who will also speak to me, but only off the record and anonymously. And then, the editors don't use my information because it's useless, because all my sources are anonymous, off the record, background only. And I'm wondering how you try to get people on some of these topics to actually speak to you on the record. How are you able to gain confidence, or is that something that you just can't do?
Thank you. When it comes to sources where you need to have sensitive documents, or that person is in authority to give you an official comment, that's where the critical issue lies, because they refuse to give you an official position on that matter. Even the Chinese themselves, Chinese businesses, we don't have Chinese businesses in Swaziland. I've tried several of them. They are not willing to talk. Now, you are faced with a difficulty in terms of validating the authenticity of that information. But with others, when they have to, like the businesses and the members of the academia, that's not a problem. But when there is critical information, it becomes a problem to get somebody commenting on record. Yeah.
I think, like you said, that your stories at times will not be published. I think we face the same issue back home, where it would be you would have good information to run to town with, but because now it's an anonymous source, it makes it more questionable compared to having one speaking on record. But what we do in my media housing is, in most cases, we try to talk to several sources to see if indeed what is being said by one source is true, rather than going with just one source or two. And at times, the policy of my media house is that you have to tell your editor, your source, even if we are not going to use the source in the story, just to be sure that it's a credible source, and just to be sure that, media in Lesotho is very polarized. And at times we run the risk of sources coming to us, telling us information that is not actually there, that is only their wishes that certain thing can happen. So it's very challenging to write a story based on anonymous sources operating in an environment that we operate under.
So it sounds like everyone shares the problem and there isn't an easy solution. Another question. Yes, at the back there.
I'll use my radio voice. That should happen. Tani Lingos is my name, freelance researcher. It would seem that there is a democratic deficit in both countries. I would like to know, do members at this stage declare their interest in the members in parliament, like you would have in South Africa, so that perhaps it makes things easier for an investigative journalist to corroborate information? Secondly, what is the state of development around the national archives in both countries?
Thank you very much. In Lesotho, there is supposed to be a law that members of parliament and other public figures are supposed to declare their interests. But that is done in secrecy. They declare their interest only to DCO, a Directorate on Corruption and Economic Offences, and those are never made public. So we don't really know their interests, and at times they'll come up and say we've declared our interests, but when we don't have a proof that they indeed have, it's kind of difficult to tell that they indeed have. On the issue of the archives, in Lesotho, it's very bad. We don't have such. And in most cases, we rely on the media houses instead of the National Archives to get information that would want to lay our hands on. And at times we find that it's most of the information is not, it's somewhat distorted because it will be reported different ways in different media houses depending on their political inclinations.
Yes, in Swaziland we do have a process where MPs do declare their businesses. But I'm not sure as far as their interest, because even the businesses, they declare some they don't declare, and nothing happens thereafter. So, yeah, it's a tricky situation. When it comes to the issue of archives, I think it would depend on the kind of material that is inside. When you want royal information and colonial information, I think such information you can get. Yes.
Further question? Over there.
From Migration and Society here at Wits. I have a question for Mongezi. I think Swaziland is an interesting kind of political context as well. It's the last remaining country with ties to Taiwan. And if you look at Taiwan from a domestic politics, I mean, you had a former president who ended up in jail for corruption. And this was even before Xi Jinping from the mainland Chinese side clamped down on corruption on officials. But can you talk a little bit about the fact how does that feed into the kind of almost tripartite relationships within how it unfolds in Swaziland in relation to where corruption and clamping down on it, where it stands, where people are pretty much aware that Mzati III is and the whole regime is quite corrupt. Is there some push from the side of Taiwan to have some sort of accountability in relation to the money that they're given, or because they're the last remaining partner within Africa, that they just close a blind eye and basically that it becomes some sort of a negotiation kind of deal from the Swazi side in order to push for more money in order to remain that kind of partnership with Taiwan rather than with the PRC. Thank you.
Can I just do a follow-up question as well, because it's related to that same question, Mongezi. So it just seems strange to me that, you know, like Roman was saying saying just now, that Swaziland is pretty much the only country in Africa now that still has diplomatic relations with Taiwan. Is it only down to the king that has this decision? I mean, one would think, why is this situation still continuing? You touched on it a little bit in your presentation, but it seems like a strange situation. Is it only the king's decision? Is it only the elites that make this decision? Isn't there some push maybe for Swaziland to join the rest of the continent in FOCAC or something? It seems like a strange situation that it seems hard for outsiders to understand. If you could maybe touch on that as well briefly.
Yes, Robert, I think well, I might not be sure of what goes around in closed doors, but from the look of things, there's this causal relationship between the royal family and Taiwan. So it goes without saying that issues of transparency and accountability cannot be pretty much dominant from the side of Taiwan, because that's the only partner they have. That's because Swaziland is the only voice that wants Taiwan to be adopted into the UN family. So I think the relationship now it's a question of closing one eye while we overlook other gross abuses. So I don't see a situation where Taiwan can stamp its authority on Swaziland. Instead, they can be partners in crime. On the issue of the push to change the alliances. Swaziland, we have an executive monarch, and everything revolves around the king. So Taiwanese relations, basically, they are strong between the king and Taiwan. So that's why the lecturer was saying, who benefits out of this relationship? So it's only the king. Of course, there are projects, community projects, that take place for the people. But when you compare that to what China is giving, it's relatively small. So I would say Parliament is weak, so there's no way. It's the decision of the king. And Parliament is an institution that hardly goes against the decision of the king. Thank you.
Further questions? Nothing further? Shall we take a slightly early break then?
Yeah, so
We'll start again at 12:45. Okay, so let's end the session. Thank you very much. Start the next session at 12:45. Thank you.